grew out of the work of the African Sex Worker Alliance, which I hope that some of you actually Google and look at some point. It's called the African Sex Worker Alliance, WWA. In 2009, sex workers and organizations working with sex workers came together from 9 African countries in Johannesburg, and they formed an African Sex Worker Alliance. At this meeting in Johannesburg, the key issue was to expose human rights violations. What was exposed were gross human rights violations, which I'm not going to go into because they're very horrific, but that was common throughout many of the sites in Africa. And the other aim of the alliance was actually to reclaim agency, and that the approach towards sex workers at that point was one of treating sex workers as passive objects as opposed to seeing them as active agents of change and acting upon people and thinking for them, as opposed to thinking with, alongside, and taking them along in a sense of partnership. So an alliance was formed, and an alliance has now been formed it's in Uganda, it's in Kenya, it's in Nigeria, it's in Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and South Africa. And some of the achievements, so within the first 2 years there were a number of achievements. I think in many ways due to the dynamism of the sex workers. And the first achievement was the establishment of national sex worker alliances. And the alliances were between donors, between NGOs, non-governmental organizations, between women's groups and the sex workers themselves. And so that was the first thing, to actually establish these national alliances. The second thing was to actually establish sex work organizations or sex work movements in these countries. Only 2 of the countries there was a sex work organization beforehand. So now in all these countries there are sex work movements, and they actually take the leading role, and they sit on the steering committee of these alliances, ensuring the whole thing about agency as opposed to being acted upon. The other achievement was actually getting representation in different national forums like HIV technical task teams. So at the level of policy making, actually saying we want to be sitting there, we want to be part of this conversation. So that was a step forward. Another key step forward was actually around mobilization of the sex workers themselves. And 2 years ago, the first march took place where 3,000 sex workers in Nairobi came up onto the streets, which was a massive, massive event for people to come out. I mean, it's a huge, huge risk for them to come out. And there's been marches subsequently in South Africa, in Namibia, a small one in Zimbabwe. So sex workers are starting to come out, but they actually start to act as role models for other sex workers, which is another achievement. Another key achievement is actually sex worker-led research. And what's been quite significant about this alliance is actually tackling some grey areas, like what Paul was talking about was actually, well, instead of just having people coming along and deciding what's important research for sex workers themselves, they actually was saying, well, this is what we think should be researched, and in fact, we think we should be part of the research. That does present challenges, but 3 pieces of research have now been undertaken, one around human rights violations, in comparing 4 countries, another around LGBTI, sex work, which Paul was involved in as well, and the other one around young people engaged in survival sex. The other grey area which they took on was the issue of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender sex workers. And at one point there was this, well, should we take this on? We get government figures are starting to talk about sex work, and as a result of the alliance we had government figures in places like Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, Kenya, and even Nigeria actually talking about perhaps sex work should be decriminalized. Now this wasn't heard, that you weren't hearing some figures in government saying this. So then when the alliance said, well, should we actually start taking on the issue of homosexuality, which is such a volatile and sensitive issue in an African context, it was a risk, but it was felt that it was very important to actually give the different dimensions of sex workers a voice, because sex work is such a complex field. I mean, there's such diverse array of complex scenarios. Another achievement was actually taken on the issue, like young people engaged in survival sex. I mean, that's such a grey area that no one wants to touch it. So, but it was taken on. So I think the alliance has actually gone to some of the difficult spaces. It also has its own challenges in the sense that when you have an alliance with people who come in at different levels and come into the alliance with different skills, that does present challenges in terms of organizational challenges. Thanks very much.